everybody. Thank you so much for joining the Corporations and Society Initiative for today's event. One of our goals at CASI is to bring perspectives to the GSB that we don't necessarily see every day from the senior executives and investment professionals that speak in our classes every week. And today we're incredibly excited to host a conversation on workers' rights in a changing economy. This topic is extremely prescient, both nationally with the new administration, within California, where Prop 22 just passed, locally, where Google workers just announced a union, and right here at Stanford, where many subcontractors did not receive pay continuation over the summer, they have not received hazard pay, and have lacked access to COVID testing resources. So I am excited to introduce my classmate, Kana Haman, who will moderate today's discussion. Kana has deep experience across community impact. She founded and led Y-Core, a nonprofit that equips young professionals with the tools to impact their communities, technology, and society. She was a product manager at the Tech and Society Solutions Lab at the Omidyar Network. And she interned last summer at the Butterfly Lab for Immigrant Narrative Strategy, where she worked to advance pro-immigrant narratives that recognize and honor the humanity of immigrants and advance freedom and justice for all. Kana, thanks so much for joining us. I'll kick it over to you.
Welcome, everybody. I am so excited to be part of this event today, and I'm really excited to first introduce our panelists, and then we'll jump into questions. Workers' rights is such an important topic right now, as so much about work and the future of work is changing, and these panelists are actively helping create that new future for the economy here in the United States. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Carlos Ramos, who's a Bay Area Lyft driver and organizer with Gig Workers Rising, which is a campaign that's supporting and educating app and platform workers, organizing for better wages, working conditions, and respect. Gig Workers Rising has organized countless meetings, listening sessions, protests, and actions. And Carlos himself was on the front lines of the fight against Proposition 22 here in California this past November, which aimed to classify gig workers as employees. It did not pass, but as he puts it, time and time again, California has told gig-based companies that they have a responsibility to their workers through organizations like Gig Workers Rising and even through the state legislature and directly from the governor's office, but companies repeatedly refuse. We also have the incredible Palak Shah here, who's the founding director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance Labs and the Social Innovations Director of NDWA. Founded in 2015, NDWA Labs was launched to experiment with new strategies for improving marketplace norms for domestic workers, including launching their very successful ALIA portable benefits app recently. And NDWA, the parent organization, is the nation's leading voice for dignity and fairness for the millions of domestic workers here in the United States, most of whom are women. Since 2007, they've been working for the respect, recognition, and inclusion of labor protections for domestic workers. And Palak's career spans the private, public, and nonprofit sectors. She's worked in healthcare, in Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick's administration, in management consulting at Accenture, and is trained as a community organizer. And she co-founded the international public health nonprofit Visions Worldwide. And last but not least, Wilneida Negrón is with us as well. She's the director of policy and research at coworker.org. And Coworker is such a cool organization. They're the leading global peer-based platform designed specifically to support workers of all kinds to spark true change in the workplace. So they were behind things like the Alphabet labor union that recently launched and have been working with, especially with workers at tech companies all over Silicon Valley to teach them skills around organizing, lending their advocacy expertise, and offering proven education and training, strategic support, research, data analysis, and so many different tools to support their efforts. Previously, Wilneida was at the Ford Foundation. She's also an adjunct assistant professor of political science at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice and an Atlantic Senior Fellow for Racial Equity, and the co-founder of the Startups in Society initiative. So Without further ado, please help me welcome our esteemed and incredible panelists. They are such experts in labor issues in the modern day, and I'm so excited that they have agreed to join us today. I was hoping that we could start off with a little bit of history and context. Many of us here at GSB in our jobs before coming to school probably had never even thought about joining a union or participating in any kind of organized labor. And Wilneida, actually the percent of workers in a union has been falling consistently for decades. And I was hoping you could help us understand, how did we get here and what opportunities do you see to reverse this trend and bring organized labor back into the mainstream?
Yeah, thank you, Ken. I'm happy to. I mean, really, in the past 40 years, it's really important to just kind of highlight three sort of broad and structural changes that have been taking place. Like, I've kind of led us to the point where we're at. The first one I would kind of highlight is sort of that, for the past 40 years, our country has really been implementing a kind of markets come first approach, or what people may have heard of as kind of market fundamentalism, or in other spaces, it's kind of sort of coined sort of like shareholder primacy, which is a corporate governance practice that places shareholders' interests above all of the other interests. And then, so we've had a free market, and then we've had a corporate governance practice that has told businesses that, your main interest is your shareholders. And this sort of like economic philosophy has been built upon, what has been kind of like deeply embedded structural racial and economic inequality. So that is one dimension. The second one that's important to call out is that in terms of sort of this market come first and kind of shareholder primacy, corporate governance practice, there has been a concerted effort to sort of weaken what has historically have been kind of checks on capital and kind of the essential kind of countervailing force for a free market, and that's the state, and that is labor, typically labor unions. In the case of the state has not only sort of retreated its role as a countervalence, but it's been sort of through the use of different domestic policies, such as deregulation, cutting corporate taxes, weakening labor protections, and at the state level, passing pro-business policies such as right-to-work laws, has essentially, the state has absolved any responsibility for sort of setting parameters and guidelines and accountability for companies to do the right thing, even if it's not right by the stakeholders, but because it's right for other stakeholders in the economy. And the third trend to all of this has been sort of like alongside these economic policies, the retreat of these two kind of countervailing forces, the state and the weakening of labor. We've had globalization and we've had rapid technology innovation. So all of these combined together have sort of like accelerated kind of the extraction of economic and social value for workers across the board, for particularly for people of color, workers of color, for women, and for who tend to sort of occupy low wage sector work, and as we're seeing right now, like gig economy jobs. And so, American workers are just working harder. And, we've all sort of heard that it's been wage stagnation while wealth has increased in other sectors. And that's sort of the kind of like at the broad level, the three trends that I would highlight that have kind of led us to where we're at right now. And then do you want me to go right into the opportunities? I think you mentioned your second question.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think really briefly, what we're seeing is, if we sort of can kind of visualize the imbalance, is that, constituencies, little by little have sort of been pushing back. Labor has been pushing back, coming off of even Occupy Wall Street and sort of the movements that persisted out of teacher organizing or the Fight for 15. Consumers have been pushing back, immigration groups, a lot of the vulnerable groups that make up kind of other stakeholders in our society have just sort of been organizing and saying like the economy is not working for us. But I think what's maybe relevant for this space and why we're all here together right now is that this sort of reality check of kind of like the imbalance of society, of the primacy of the markets. These conversations are also taking place in corporate governance and capital markets and finance spaces. The awareness that we are not creating an economy that's going to be sustainable for anyone in the long term. And so the opportunity right now, I think what's really exciting is that there's an opportunity to build unlikely, like new coalitions across what is a multiple set of stakeholders, from finance to corporate governance spaces to labor to immigration groups that are all sort of pointing to the same thing. So I think that is sort of like what's creating a lot of opportunity for really doing something with where we find ourselves at the moment.
Yeah, thank you so much. Palak, to build on that, Wilneida mentioned so many different sectors and parts of the labor market that are starting to organize, but you work with a population that's kind of prohibited from unionizing. So can you help us understand domestic workers and that segment that may not have access to unions right now?
Yes, so you know, a lot of people don't know this, but domestic workers as an entire sector are prohibited from forming a union. They're, and on its own, that doesn't mean anything. So let me explain a little bit about the trajectory of how we've kind of gotten to where we are. So first, who are domestic workers? Domestic workers are the mostly women workforce in this country and all around the world, who take care of children, they care and clean for our homes, they take care of people who are aging or those with disabilities. And the common thing that unites this workforce is that they work in the privacy of other people's homes. And when we think about work, at least in the kind of modern economy, that is not necessarily what we're thinking about, right? We have had a more recent paradigm around you're going to a factory or you're going to an office. Of course, things are changing with the rise of the internet, and what work looks like in this age is changing. But in many ways, and I often say this, that the domestic workers of this country are some of the country's original gig workers, right? They've always been working in precarious, informal, in the shadows, off the grid, underground type conditions. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And if you will allow me just briefly to explain the story of how did we get here such that domestic workers do not have the right to unionize, along with farm workers and independent contractors in this country. So I guess the TLDR, right, is in the 1930s when the foundational labor laws of this country were being passed, right? And among that, you can think about the National Labor Relations Act or the Fair Labor Standards Act or a whole host of labor laws, right, that were passed that established kind of the norms that we take for granted in this country, that your work, you know, you're entitled to a minimum wage, or you're entitled to certain protections, or if you get hurt at work, there are some responsibilities that exist in that employment relationship. So when those laws were being passed in the 1930s, as most major political enterprise, right, that happens in Congress and in lawmaking, there was a compromise that needed to get struck in order for the bill to have, those bills in that movement to have enough votes. And what happened was that as a concession to Southern lawmakers, domestic workers and farm workers were carved out of virtually all of those labor protections because those workers were Black. And it is a direct legacy of slavery and Jim Crow South and a whole history in this country of who gets to be protected by our laws and who doesn't. And what that has led to is a whole host of exclusions that continue. Some, you know, were the most recent of which were only changed under the Obama administration, just, you know, 8 years ago or so, around some provisions around home care workers. So there is this kind of historical and racial legacy that persists around why is this work not protected? But there are also more pragmatic things about this workforce that actually make it difficult to improve the working conditions. It's important to know, right, that there are about 2.5 million domestic workers in this country. A quarter of them are earning below minimum wages. Most of them are working in informal situations, cash markets. A large number of the workers in our industry are immigrants and immigrant women, many of whom are undocumented and don't have a path to working legally in this country, right? And so when you take all of those conditions and then you layer on the fact that people are working in the privacy of other people's homes. And this is an interesting part of labor markets and the way that they function, because there is the absence of a firm for the most part, right, in the labor markets for domestic workers. Now, of course, we'll get to this in a minute, but Silicon Valley and the entrance of Silicon Valley into domestic work markets is changing the presence of firms in our markets. But for generations, this has been an informal referral, word of mouth, household labor market. And with that has come a whole bunch of informality and this idea that this work is not real work as we think about work, other kinds of work in the economy. So much of that, and I'll wrap up, so much of that has to do with our ideas about who performs this work, because it is the majority women, historically and today, that do the work of caring for children, do the work of caring for our elders, do the work of cleaning our homes. And that it is the assertion of our movement that those cultural ideas, those ideas that that's not real work, then influences the lack of, structural and legal protections and continues to undervalue and invisibilize this work in our economy, even though we would assert that this is the work that actually makes other work possible. And for those of you who have children or who have worked with people who have children, if they don't have childcare, they're not coming to work, right? So I'll kind of leave it at that, but there's a long racial and gendered history to why it is that this workforce, among many other protections that it doesn't have the right to form a union. I will just say, though, in our sector, while we, of course, we're a social movement made up of women workers, we believe in the collective action of workers and workers being the protagonists of creating an equitable and democratic set of conditions. But the structural nature of our labor markets, the fact that each employer only has one worker for the most part in that relationship, means that a union, as we currently understand it, doesn't apply in this sector, because there's no collective workforce with one employer, which is kind of the basis of the paradigm of unionization. So that doesn't mean we don't believe in collective action and we don't believe in workers' rights. We're a worker rights organization, but it begs the question, what is the right structure for a workforce like ours in improving the conditions at work?
Thank you so much for that background and taking us a bit back into history as well. Carlos, can you build on that a bit more? Of course, as Palak mentioned, gig workers for, say, Uber or Lyft or TaskRabbit are not the first people to be working in a gig or contract or informal capacity, but it's a style of work that Silicon Valley companies, the same companies that many of us will go to work for after GSB, are turning to as their main labor force. So can you tell us, from a worker perspective, what are some of the implications of this? And what, as workers, are you trying to advocate for right now?
Yeah, sure. So the implications of the gig economy growing, they're sweeping, because when you really put into the scope of things, all work could be labeled as gig work. And in the future, that's something we may very well have to deal with. And just because somebody is labeled a gig worker, that doesn't make them not a worker anymore. I've been a gig worker. I was a Lyft driver for 3.5 years. I've done 10,000 rides, and I, bought the car, and I went all in. And the idea of all work becoming gig work is very, very scary, because I know what it's like to do this job, and I know what it's like to be in the gig economy. Gig workers, they deserve the same protections that all the other workers done. And as we move forward into developing this new idea of what labor is and a new idea about work is, it's very important that we do not strip away the things that got us here, the protections and the responsibilities that the employer has to the employee that fostered this community that was able to allow these companies to become successful. Right now in this country, that's what this fight is about. That's why we're having this discussion, is because there's a group of people who want to strip away these things to make their bottom line more profitable. And it's at the expense of all these workers. Right now, what this country needs is good jobs, and gig jobs are, they're precarious, and gig workers are vulnerable. And so gig jobs need to be good jobs where workers have wages and rights and their protections that they deserve.
And of course, all of these challenges have been amplified by COVID. There's been devastating effects on essential workers. Palak, can you, and then Wilneida, and then Carlos, will go to you, share more about what workers that you're organizing with, or that you're organizing or working with, have been doing to advocate for better conditions, or things like hazard pay, and especially what should employers be doing differently moving forward?
Mm-hmm. I appreciate the question. And I think, the advocacy for improved working conditions has a long and rich history in our country. But the COVID crisis was a real turning point, I think, in a lot of the conversations, because it revealed a lot of what Carlos has both experienced personally, but is also naming on behalf of other workers in the economy, right? In the kind of vulnerability and the fact that many people in this country, many people are just living barely paycheck to paycheck, week to week to week. And I know when I was in grad school at Harvard, and when I was, when I'm in all of these kinds of academic settings, it's hard to really understand for many people what that really is like. And I raise it because in some ways there isn't anything new that happened, right, with the COVID crisis, except for the fact that all of us collectively saw a lot of that precarity up front and began to really grapple with what is truly essential in our lives, right? And that is an opportunity for us, all of us together as a society and as a country, I think, not to unsee what we have seen and what became, sharper and in focus for all of us during the crisis. So in broad brushstrokes, I would say, from our perspective, we have always said that domestic workers are essential workers. And I think the crisis really made that clear for anybody who had their kids at home from school or, was juggling a whole bunch while trying to be on Zoom calls or do your classes or your work. That all became, really, really sharp and difficult for the majority of people, and working people in this country. But broad strokes, we've been fighting for legislation. For example, we have introduced a federal bill of rights for domestic workers to correct a lot of these historical wrongs. And I think we, when we saw what kind of is coming out of the Biden administration, a focus on the care economy as it relates to the care crisis and the kind of lifting up of frontline care workers, right? Whether it's domestic workers or nurses or doctors, all up and down the chain in terms of kind of pay and prestige of job. We're seeing a respect and recognition emerge around those workers. I think the question that's before all of us right now is what will actually be done to change the situation. But I think there's a lot of opportunity that we're seeing on the policy and legislative arenas. I will also say, I don't think, obviously social change movements like ourselves focus a great deal on legislation, right? Because in some ways it's about establishing fair rules like across the entire economy upon which enterprise and innovation can function and build upon. But I think one of the exciting things about our work in this moment was because we have a tech lab and we had a product that was a social safety net kind of product for domestic workers and informal workers that was, I would say an MVP kind of early beta stage. Like, we were able to pivot in this moment and also fill in the gaps where the government wasn't able to reach our workforce, given the fact that many of our workers are unbanked or are just operate off the grid. And so our platform Aaliyah we pivoted in this moment in a partnership with Google to essentially step in and distribute cash grants to domestic workers who wouldn't have otherwise had any form of relief by virtue of their immigration status or the fact that they just work informally and in cash. So I'll stop there. There's a lot that has been done in this moment. And I think one of the most important opportunities we have collectively, business school students and labor activists and everybody, is to actually, hold on to what we have seen and experienced in this moment, and then use that to drive the kinds of new changes, the DNA we want to instill in like a new kinds of whatever is emerging. Hold on to that as we move forward.
And I think for us, what we saw was sort of what COVID tested was in the absence of kind of some of the things that I've mentioned, like OSHA, the last administration that we had sort of had gutted a lot of the federal labor organizations that would have been involved around kind of like workplace safety issues like OSHA. And so in the absence of the state telling you to provide workplace safety for your workers or paid sick leave time, et cetera, and as some companies were making public statements about, community and COVID and kind of the themes that like Palak has been talking about, like having this sense of like, we're in this together. How do they perform when, it's really, other than public statements, the state not obligating the companies to do anything, are companies going to do the right thing by workers? And what we saw from a lot of the workers that we supported across kind of healthcare, retail, supermarket, even gig economy, and the travel sectors, is that a lot of companies did not take a proactive stance. It took a lot of worker organizing to get paid sick leave, to get hazard pay. A lot of the hazard pay that happened in the retail sector was very time bound. It was either very specific set of money, like a $200 and that's it, or like hazard pay for 3 months and then it dissolved. That was given to workers after a lot of organizing. The entities that were proactive in sort of recognizing what essential workers were facing during a COVID crisis were the ones that actually went above and beyond and sort of, offered paid leave and PPE, and all those things were far and few between. So after workers organized to get some of these basic things in place, everything was very limited and time bound. And so it was very fragmented kind of corporate response that we saw that took a lot of accountability checking. And then on the other extreme, there were in some states, entities, firms that just refused to enforce social distancing. For example, we supported a group of immigration workers and concerned citizen advocates in Elkhart, which was sort of, it's America's kind of RV capital of the world, where the world's kind of recreational vehicle manufacturing takes place. And a lot of the workforce that works in those RV companies are undocumented immigrant workers. And a group of concerned citizens had noticed that a lot of these companies were they were not providing PPE, and they were not enforcing social distancing. So some companies just completely, did not care about protecting their workers, as they were forcing them to still come to work. And again, this was like, we're still in the COVID pandemic, but this was really around the summer and early August. So there was a wide spectrum of responses. And then the gig economy piece, I think what was really interesting in the beginning was what happened with Uber, which whereas in New York State in particular, as Uber drivers were trying to access PUA, that's the pandemic unemployment relief that was given, that gig economy workers could have access as opposed to the other unemployment benefit that was available, that Uber was delaying giving the New York State Department of Labor the driver's wage data that was needed to process. So Uber drivers in New York State had to organize to get Uber to give their wage data to the New York State Department of Labor to be able to access unemployment benefits. So, you know, can you count on companies better angels if in the absence of strong enforcement or guidelines at the state level? You know, I think the response from COVID is like, no, you can't. It will be very, very fragmented, very consistent, and it takes an extreme amount of kind of willpower of a workforce that, as we've already talked about, has been pretty weakened and doesn't have a lot of protections, doesn't have a lot of voice. It takes a lot to organize that and to build that power to be able to get very basic things in the middle of a crisis. So I think, you know, in terms of like, what do you do going forward? I think right now it's especially for like this community of people that are participating in this webinar right now. It's important for companies to think about what kind of mechanisms are they building to listen to kind of frontline workers, not only for the next crisis that comes on, but to start to understand the needs of your whole workforce, not just, you know, certain particular segments of it. Also at this time, there's also kind of what I described, what we saw during COVID, which was like this kind of company by company, because there was no national guidelines. It was battle of, you know, what's happening at Whole Foods, what's happening at Kroger's, what's happening at Walmart, what's happening at Trader Joe's. And I think what you're seeing right now, the next phase of building worker power is going to take a close look of making changes at the sectoral level so that we can start to raise standards across a particular sector, like, you know, retail or entertainment. I mean, there's lots of workers in many different sectors that are looking at that model, and that, or even looking at things like wage boards at the city level or at the state level. There's a lot happening in California at the moment. And, or even working some of the NGO efforts that I'll just flag, like Workers Defense Project, a Better Builder program, that's trying to work with the private sector around increasing the standards and the wages of workers in the construction sector. So what I would say is that what companies could do, learning from what we're learning of what's happened in COVID, and the need to do more sectoral type of bargaining, is to start thinking about organizing companies in your sector as well, to, again, be proactive, be a good corporate citizen and be proactive. Not only because this is coming down the line in terms of how workers are thinking about what is the next step of building worker power, but also because if you want to be a proactive citizen, that would be a corporate citizen with your other companies, start to see not only your company's role in one particular sector, and start to do the corporate version of what Coworker does. Start to organize other companies that are saying like, hey, let's work together to raise the standards in our sector, because we see what's happening in the retail sector. We see what's happening in the gig economy. And know that if companies are reluctant to move to that path, that is what's happening on the ground on the labor side. So at some point, this kind of sectoral bargaining is going to be something that they'll be approaching.
And Carlos, you know, the Prop 22 legislative campaign to classify gig workers as employees of companies was happening during the COVID crisis. Can you talk about why you chose to go the legislative route rather than, say, organizing directly and appealing to the companies themselves, and what the implications are now that people voted for gig workers to not be considered employees and to just continue being classified as contractors?
Yeah, well, we did, just to touch on that first part of the question, we did approach the companies themselves. There was a large community organizing within the gig workers, the rideshare drivers, to approach the the companies prior to Proposition 22 and even prior to AB5, but there was always reluctancy on the company's part to really see their workers, us, as part of their business model. And so we were never really given we were never afforded the ability to negotiate with them. And the legislative, they were happening in conjunction at one point, but it became very obvious very quickly that the legislative approach was the only approach that was going to have any kind of action. And so we put our full weight behind defeating Proposition 22, and before that, approving Assembly Bill AB5. And with the passage of Prop 22, it's definitely a blow to gig workers. And it's not just a blow to gig workers, but it's also a blow to our democracy as a whole. To kind of fully understand that, you kind of got to understand where Proposition 22 started from. And so Proposition 22 was a reaction to Assembly Bill 5. And Assembly Bill 5 was codifying a California Supreme Court ruling to the Dynamax case, which defined what an independent contractor was and what an employee was. And so AB5 comes along and really wants to put teeth behind this thing, and it's kind of closing some loopholes that have been around for a very long time, and it allows clear, defined definition between what an independent contractor is and what an employee is. It goes through our state legislate. It was signed by our governor, and come January 1st of 2019, it was law. And what we had these major companies, Uber, Lyft, Doordash, Instacart, Postmates, I think, deciding they didn't want to follow the law. They said, we don't want to do this. We're going to write our own law, which became Proposition 22. That turned into a $200 million proposition. That's the most anybody's ever spent on any kind of proposition. That beat out big oil, big pharma, that beat out tobacco. Okay, just to put it in perspective. And so November 6th, they won by a lot, actually. And what that does is it strips away any kind of benefits, any kind of protections that gig workers had won democratically. And these are the things that we need to just progress. I mean, like now we have workers working for less than almost $6 an hour. You know what I mean? And what these companies are doing now is they're saying that they're going to extend this. They're looking beyond California, and they want to change the nature of how all work is done. They've already signaled that they want to create a new version of work. And now and when you think about that, it's crazy because, why should a company be able to dictate which laws they get, they pass, and now how that, and change the laws and write their own laws. So it sacrifices the many just to help the very few. And so it's just a wild time to be an organizer and a gig worker right now.
Absolutely. And Palak, NDWA Labs has also been, because you're working in technology, because so many domestic workers are now signing up for the ALEA platform, you're also starting to explore working more closely with tech companies. Can you speak to the role that you think that tech and tech leadership should have in this future?
Yeah, so we have had a really interesting, to say the least, relationship with Silicon Valley. On the one hand, we have had a long track record when it's in the interests of our workers of collaborating with large technology companies, Thumbtack, Care.com, Airbnb. We have a whole kind of body of work that I have led that has been around advancing workers' interests in collaboration. And we've also had a very ugly and nasty public fight with other companies such as Handy around changing laws and essentially taking rights away from workers back a few years ago. And I think ultimately we're anchored to our North Star, but what I was saying in my opening remarks is that our industry is being completely transformed by the entrance of Silicon Valley into what has been previously disaggregated, atomized, and informal labor markets. And that is creating, it is different than what is happening to drivers and the role that Uber and Lyft are playing in the driving market. So I won't pretend to be an expert or make parallels between the domestic work sector and other sectors. But in our sector, which is what I am an expert on, is our industry is being fundamentally reshaped by both the rise of the internet and the entrance of venture-backed tech into these markets. And fundamentally what's happening is that the profit motive, as well as the entrance of firms, I think fundamentally changes the future for workers. Now, some of that is because it's just math, right? You introduce a middleman into a relationship and they need to take their cut, which makes sense in the logic of everything that's emerging, but it doesn't make sense because the market, everybody needs care, right? Everybody needs childcare, everybody needs care when they're getting older, and the market can only sustain, especially with rising inequality, a certain price point around what can the majority of Americans who need care afford to pay for care. And so I fear, right, that without some proactive, thoughtful intervention in the reshaping of these labor markets, we will continue to see a driving down of wages and more precarity that emerges in this industry. I don't think it's all hopeless, and I don't think it's all evil. I actually think that technology is playing a really interesting role in the way that the domestic work labor market is functioning. And I think there's an opportunity that emerges with the aggregation that we're starting to see in our markets, right? Because if you think about, we have 2.5 million workers, all of whom work behind closed doors. We have no idea, the government has no idea, nobody has any idea which homes are workplaces across this country. That means, like, even when we do pass laws, and our movement has been so successful in extending basic rights and bringing domestic workers into the baseline, which probably we all on this panel would agree is still too low, but nonetheless, bringing domestic workers into the baselines that do exist, like, it's impossible to enforce those laws, especially in informal markets, right? And what's interesting about the aggregating nature of technology is that there is an opportunity, I think, if we can crack the code, and this is what NDWA Labs and the tech and the products that we're building is seeking to do, is to try and like harness the power of technology's aggregating force to be in service of improved working conditions and worker voice for our workforce. Now there's a lot of ifs in there, right? Like a lot of things have to go right in order for that to happen. And I'm well aware of that. And also, like, I'm an organizer by training, and that means I'm an optimist. I believe that we can actually transform the conditions of work, but I don't think it will just happen automatically, right? And I don't think that simply moving work from offline contexts into online contexts is somehow an innovation in and of itself, because I don't think that's going to actually result in the transformation that care workers and domestic workers, even as proxies of gig workers and precarious workers in the country, what they're going to need. Again, it doesn't, but I still think that there's a lot of opportunity here. And I, 5 years ago, I started talking about this, where like the DNA, right, of new labor markets, like through platforms and marketplaces and on demand, like the DNA of how labor markets function is being written right now. And which kind of brings me back to this like point that I was making in the chat, which is, I think fundamentally there is a very important role, not an exclusive role, but an important role for true leadership to emerge from tech and business sectors. And that's not to say that alone is going to solve the problems. We are going to continue to organize workers as we do. We are going to have a contest, right, around what the rules of the game should be through the government establishing and enforcing those rules. But there is this moment, and I have always said this, especially in tech, where there is an ethos of wanting to do good. And I think that if we can, and I think it's different in that industry than maybe many other industries, right? That there is an opening if there was true leadership to emerge. and a real opportunity to say, hey, okay, we're actually going to work on solving the same problem. Not the problem that, my exclusive problem of delivering profit to my shareholders right? But that actually seeing that all of this activity, labor market activity, especially when you have the responsibility of running a labor market platform of any kind, that you are actually have stakeholders and should be, I think, cognizant and responsive to the externalities of that labor market platform. So I, personally, I am, and this might be naive to some extent, I am open to how we get there, but we need to get there. And I think that's part of the challenge right now is I don't think we have agreement. And I think this is partly a function of the lack of leadership, that it is sufficient leadership on where we're trying to go and whose problems are we really trying to solve.
And Wilneida, Coworker.org is working to build that kind of leadership directly within tech companies. And what's been incredible for me to see is that you're working with people across the hierarchy and teaching them how to organize, right? So you're working with cafeteria workers at tech companies, with content moderators, also with engineers who are threatening or do end up deciding to quit their jobs because they don't agree with the company's policies. So can you speak more? And recently at Alphabet, formerly Google, they actually created a workers union. So can you speak more about that and how Silicon Valley is kind of changing how labor organizing can be done in the future? And this will be our last question too, before Q&A. So I'm going to hand it over to Scoop now. I unfortunately have to run to class, but Wilneida, if you can speak to that while we transition, and then we can move to Q&A, that would be awesome.
Bye, Kina. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to just do some very brief history. I mean, I think it's workers have organized not only to improve their wages, but also gain more control over their work. Going specifically tech workers, going back to the 1970s, employees at Polaroid and IBM, which were the kind of the big tech firms in the 70s, did organize at different points to, for example, like protest or companies' business with South Africa's government while it was enforcing apartheid. And I think as the erosion of kind of the union's traditional industrial base has been taking place the past 30 years, and the rise of this tech economy is emerging, it is, and so all of these issues that have been named by all of the other panelists here around kind of the outsized role of technology and society in labor markets, and in particular in adding to this precariousness that's happening, that workers have been experiencing. It has been interesting for co-workers specifically to create space among other groups for workers to, a lot of this work began just creating the space for workers to talk about these reflections, these experiences among themselves, and to build networks and relationships that move at the speed of trust. A lot of this work goes back to even 3 or 4 years ago. And that these creating the spaces for workers to have these conversations and deal with kind of these morality and ethical things of what they're seeing of wanting to work in these companies, but knowing that it was doing all of the things that have been already named in the space, was sort of the first thing that led to kind of this awakening of like, what do we do next? What happened after that was that, especially around some of the sexual harassment concerns that happened in some of these tech companies, was that the leadership was not there internally to be able, the incongruences in creating a culture that doesn't want to do harm wasn't there. So a lot of these workers went from talking among their colleagues to, let's approach our internal HR, that there was actually, the culture was not aligned. It was sort of HR pushed a lot of these concerns to the side, minimized, tried to fragment workers among each other. And so there was a breakdown, an immediate breakdown in sort of the responses that workers were feeling. And that just sort of upped the ante of, if there are concerns, if workers don't have, if these companies don't have actual internal basic human resource and a leadership internally that gives these workers an opportunity to air these concerns, what is the next level thing? And so in the past number of years, probably 3 or 4, there have been examples of collectively building that voice, where there was a kickstarted, United paved the way and showed it, they were the first ones to really show it was possible to unionize tech. The Google HCL contractors in Pittsburgh a few years ago also showed how important it was to build a union that prioritized their needs, given how salaries tend to be much lower for Google full-time employees. And a lot of these, and now we're seeing the most visible kind of outcome of what have been years of conversations of basic breakdowns in HR responses to center workers' voices, to listen to workers. And now you see sort of the breakdown of multiple systems in the tech, the lack of leadership, and the most visible outcome, which is what everyone's looking right now, it's the Alphabet Union, and what is now also kind of become Alpha Global, the 13 unions that are now representing workers in 10 countries. So as far as what that means for the future of labor organizing in Silicon Valley, I would say that those networks, those friendships, those spaces that have been created outside of the workplace because they don't exist in these tech companies in a way that makes workers feel safe, they are not going to go away. And workers are learning how to build power through all of the examples that I've named, going back to Kickstarter and now. And so what is going to be your leadership as potential future CEOs? What are going to be your HR systems? What are going to be your ways to not be in an adversarial mode with these issues, but understanding them historically and responding to them in a way that can create outcomes, better outcomes for everyone from the top to the bottom down.
Thanks, Wilneida. That's a great point there at the end. There's a lot of energy from the audience around this kind of at least perceived debate, Carlos, between flexibility and employment status, and the idea that being a contractor means you're more flexible. And I'll just kind of summarize the questions by saying we had a speaker the other day from TaskRabbit in a different campus event who framed their position on Prop 22 by saying every time we talk to our workers, they say they want flexibility, and that's why we took the position that we took. So how do you respond to kind of that narrative when you hear that argument?
Yeah, that's a really important question. It's a very interesting question. Okay, but first you have to understand that this gig work is not, although it's highly popularized now, it's not new. And you can go back to other industries that also have gig work, like the stage handling union. Those jobs often operate on gig, on like this freelancer kind of like, with the time flexibility. So it's not, as we're proceeding on, as we're growing this gig economy, it's important that we do not throw the baby out with the bathwater kind of thing. There's good parts to gig work that offers a very good ability to manage your life and your work in ways that are not really traditional. But it's coming at a cost that it's not affordable. It's saying, you know what, if you want to be able to, work a 2 p.m. or a 2 a.m. schedule on Thursdays and Tuesdays and work on Monday, work a 1 p.m. to a 5 p.m. on Mondays and Wednesdays, you can do it, but we're going to take away everything that keeps you safe. We're going to take away everything that you deserve. And so it really comes down to, it's not a question of flexibility and employment status. It's as we start to evolve into this new way we're doing work, we have to maintain these protections. And so that's the question. It shouldn't be a question of either or, it should be both or nothing.
Thanks, Carlos. And I don't think I'm going to get to all the questions from the audience. I apologize. But the next one I want to go to is, it's a question, and probably Palak is best positioned to answer this, around, whether it's through a union or just through pressuring companies. There are some industries where there are kind of clear employers or clear adversaries, so to speak, that you can kind of push on. And how do you think about that for domestic work, where the marketplace is like so much more distributed and there's not necessarily like that one big employer to push on for change?
Yeah, so it makes things actually kind of difficult, but it's also in some cases a little easier politically when you think about where does opposition emerge from, in the ways that we've seen, for example, the AB5 and the Prop 22 play out in California. In our, and in many ways, because of the disaggregated nature of our labor market, because, and this is really idiosyncratic and I think interesting about our workforce, because so much of the work is about caring. It's like, it's very difficult to be in a long-term antagonistic relationship that is about caring. And I think what we have learned from the workers directly in our movement is that basically everybody is facing care challenges across this economy, and that it is a mistake to relegate it to the realm of the individual problem, or it's a deficiency with something you're doing, versus care being a collective solution that we all need some solution to. So that's one dimension. I think we kind of see it as domestic workers are also oftentimes employers, because where do they leave their children when they have to go to work, right? And so there is a way in which we are conceptualizing what's needed as we're all kind of in this together. That doesn't mean we don't have, bad actors and egregious employers that should be punished for wage theft, or, these cases you may have heard about diplomats locking their domestic workers in their base, like just crazy stuff on one end of the spectrum, trafficking, really, and modern day slavery too, like very, very harmonious multi-generational relationships that do exist. And then we see everything in between. I think our approach, though, to be brief, has been to do a sectoral approach, to say we're going to establish laws and rules of the game in New York or in Hawaii or in Massachusetts and all the places where we've passed laws. And now we seek to do that at the federal level through the introduction of the National Bill of Rights, one set of rules for the way that this market functions. That, of course, will raise a whole bunch of questions around how do you enforce that? And, it's kind of like anything that has innovation, right? You solve one problem and 5 more problems are going to emerge, and we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But I think that is kind of the approach that we are taking, which is, one, we're all in this together. Everybody needs care, and that we should view care as a collective problem to be addressed and solved, not just an individual one.
Thanks. And to close out here, I'd love to hear just like 30 seconds from each of you. We're training for a degree in management. And what advice do you have to us as future business leaders as we think about workers' rights and including workers' voices in our companies? And I guess I'll start with Wilneida and then go to Carlos and then Palak.
I think just in closing, it's just I reject all false dichotomies that say it's either business or either workers, and realize that we can have both. And, as future leaders in your own companies or other companies, there is a way to meet the fiduciary responsibilities that you're going to have to your whoever helped to finance or whoever else is helping to invest in an endeavor that you're doing. But there's also a way to have workers have a good wage, to engage workers proactively and show authentic leadership in these spaces. So My advice would be, the either or mentality of the 60s and the 70s is told us is going to go one way, and that's the way of business. And now we're reimagining that we can work together and build the bridges across those things to improve the economy for everyone.
I guess I'm next. I'd like to pose a question to you. Like, what do you want to be when you grow up? Like, what do you want your legacy, your whole body of work to look like when people here that are looking to innovate, that are looking to disrupt, that are looking to become the next, great success story? So I implore you to innovate, but innovate with workers in mind. Be that change, be that thing, because work like business has people they have to satisfy. They have to satisfy themselves, they have to satisfy their customers, and they have to satisfy their employees. And the only way these things are successful is if all of them are satisfied. And when you take away one, you're making it less stable and you're not able to grow at that point. And I know we're going to be looking towards Uber and Lyft on this gig platform because it's new and it's exciting. But I want to remind you that it might be too soon to tell. Uber has never been profitable in its history. It has a customer base that increasingly hates them. And now we have an administration that's openly hostile to their business model. And so that may be the lesson that we take on how these companies achieve in the future and how they treat their workers in the present.
Thanks, Carlos. And Palak, why don't you close us out?
Sorry, guys, I muted because my kid was screaming in the bathtub. So I have three things to offer you. One is, I think it's important that we move away from this idea that any job is a good job. And by creating any job, we're actually doing good. There is a big shift happening around thinking about good jobs. And, that will mean different things in different contexts. But I implore you to think about the difference between job access and job quality. The second is that work is work is work is work. An hour of work in this context should be protected the same as an hour of work in another context. And so thinking about how we actually solve for equal protection, like avoid gaming, these bifurcated markets and rules that we have that encourage gaming, like how do we move towards like true and fair competition based on equal rules? And this idea that every hour of work should be protected, as Carlos has said. And then lastly, I would encourage you to have a process with yourself where you're asking yourself continuously, whose problem am I solving? And am I creating more problems than I'm solving?
Thank you all so much. I know we're a few minutes over. Thanks for staying extra. This was fantastic. Thank you everyone for joining.